Those days are over. You are going to be doing the heavy lifting in Europe to look after your own security, and we'll decide whether we want to get behind you if we feel there is a need. And that was a pretty cold shower.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. After a big weekend at the Munich Security Conference, we're speaking to senior research fellow John Lough, who was present. He saw JD Vance's controversial speech, so he's speaking to us about the relationship between the US and Russia and how European allies have responded to this. He is telling us that the state of NATO is kind of on a brink. He thinks that perhaps the US might pull out eventually. So all that and more today on the Trump Report. John Lough, Senior Research Fellow and Head of Foreign Policy at the new Eurasian Strategy Centre. Thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today. We've had such a busy weekend with the Munich Security Conference and so much has happened in the days that followed, but I want to start timely. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has arrived in Saudi Arabia to begin these early stage negotiations with his Russian counterparts. We know that neither Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin will be there, but how do you expect these negotiations to kick off without the representation of anyone from Ukraine?
Well, I think the first indication we have from Marco Rubio is that these talks are not going to be specifically about Ukraine. It's about trying to establish a framework for putting together a meeting between Presidents Trump and Putin. So from that point of view, that it might be looking at the more sort of organizational side of things, the sequencing, what needs to be in place in order to get to that summit meeting. So at least that's a signal that Rubio has sent. And I actually don't really know whether the Americans are sufficiently prepared at this stage for a detailed negotiation with the Russians about what a settlement might look like. I mean, it's clear that this 90-minute conversation took place last week between Putin and Trump, and no doubt that started to get into, I suppose, some of the basic details and expectations of what the both sides are looking for. But I can assume there was no detailed negotiation. But at the same time, the Americans have signaled that, first of all, the issue of NATO membership for Ukraine, in their view, is off the table. And secondly, that they don't see the prospect of American boots being on the ground to police any peace agreement. And on the face of it, those are two significant concessions to the Russians, and maybe part of Trump's strategy for getting them to the table. So I think it's probably premature to speculate just how much progress the two sides are going to make in Riyadh. But I would be surprised if Marco Rubio got into the real detail.
Okay, well, yeah, I guess it's a wait and watch situation for this meeting, John, but I guess we'll go into the weekend that unfolded. You were in Munich for the security conference, and it was a more controversial weekend than anyone had kind of expected. It seems right now that it's quite divided between America and Europe, and the stance on the Russia-Ukraine war is more divided now than it was going into the weekend. You were at the conference, as I said. Can you walk me through your big takeaways from the weekend when it comes to trying to put an end to this war?
Well, I think the big takeaway for me is just how big the gap is becoming between Washington and its allies in Europe, and it's clear that this new American administration is determined, first of all, to bring the war to an end in Ukraine, but at the same time, it wants to reconfigure its relations with Europe, and particularly in the area of security and defence. So I felt there was a pretty brutal message delivered to the European allies at the weekend, which is that the situation that you've enjoyed for the last 30 years or so, or 75 years if you think about it in terms of US contribution to European security, those days are over. You are going to be doing the heavy lifting in Europe to look after your own security, and we'll decide whether we want to get behind you if we feel there is a need. And that was a pretty cold shower, and people were astonished by the J.D. Vance speech, which didn't mention either Ukraine or indeed the Middle East. It had been billed by the Munich Security Conference as an announcement that the US was going to be withdrawing forces from Europe. And we didn't even get that. So in a sense, sort of people were already bracing themselves for something really bad. And, to some extent felt they just got this sort of really big rap over the knuckles. But I think about European democracy, but when they stepped back, I think they could see that the United States is now talking to Europe in a very different tone. And we are entering, I think, a new age. I think the era of NATO as we knew it has come to an end, and the US is simply not going to be committed in the same way as before.
Was your takeaway, I guess, from that weekend, and from especially after J.D. Vance did that speech, was your takeaway that NATO, the state of NATO, does hang in the balance?
Yes, that is very much my impression, and I expect the US to announce that it will be gradually withdrawing forces from Europe, but I think they probably want to, at least some people in the administration, and the administration is split on this issue, I think, they want to see what Europe can really put on the table, but the signalling is very clear that they are withdrawing. They have other priorities.
You see the US withdrawing from NATO?
I think it will be a gradual process, and it doesn't mean to say they're just going to sort of collapse NATO in a couple of days. But the point to me is that if they reduce their military presence in Europe, then the logic of extended deterrence is no longer there, because the sort of tripwire you have in terms of US forces being in Europe and then being potentially attacked by an aggressor, the US would not then be required to respond in the same way. So I think we need to get our minds around that we are not going to be under a US nuclear umbrella as we were before.
And I think there's cause for concern on that, John, just in the way that Donald Trump approached withdrawing from the WHO as an example of just how abrupt he can be when it comes to, and obviously the Paris Climate Agreement, which is not on the same level of I guess reliance, but it is something to look at. But I want to go back to these comments from J.D. Vance. His speech was, I guess, probably the biggest talking point when leaving the Munich Security Conference. It was a very kind of, I guess, self-interested speech about the US. It was considered an attack on European allies. But a US Senator Adam Schiff, he on the weekend basically said that J.D. Vance remarks at the conference were an attack on our allies and a gift to the Kremlin. Is that a statement that you agree with?
Yeah, I think very much so. The champagne corks have undoubtedly been popping in Moscow, because in some ways he was reading from their script, and by telling the Germans in particular that they need to admit the AfD party into politics properly. In other words, that other parties need to cooperate with it in Parliament and perhaps even bring it into government. Was for Germany as an absolutely outrageous statement, and interference in their domestic politics a week ahead of the election. And given that Germany recognises there are some elements of the AfD that are extremist, and there is this so-called a firewall in German politics at the moment to keep them out. This is a party that is very sympathetic to Putin personally, to his goals, is opposed to support for Ukraine, believes that the West was responsible for provoking war in Ukraine. So, these are people who've enjoyed close links with the Kremlin for many years, and many regard in Germany and beyond as their puppets. So, for J.D. Vance to be making common cause with them was a remarkable signal.
John, do you think that after the conference, and especially after J.D. Vance's comments, do you think that, using the words that you used before, do you think that it made it quite clear that Trump and the Trump administration have just become puppets to Putin?
Well, I think it's difficult to make that judgment at this stage. They have sent some mixed signals over recent weeks. I don't know if you recall that Trump even spoke about imposing tariffs and sanctions on Russia. In his view, what sort of tariffs he had in mind, I'm not quite sure. The General Kellogg, who is the special envoy for Ukraine, it's not clear what role he's going to play from now on, because he's not part of the central negotiating team with the Russians. He's used some quite strong language about the need to put the Russians under pressure to achieve compromise on their part. And if the Americans really wanted to, then in terms of Russia's main source of revenue at the moment, which is oil sales, they could do a lot to make it actually very difficult for the Russians to earn money in the same way as they do at the moment. They could encourage the Saudis to pump more oil. They could displace Russian oil from the market. So they have a lot of cards. In fact, I would say that President Trump has some very good cards if he wants to play them. And added to that, my view is that Putin is already under quite a lot of pressure, even though he could probably carry on for a long time fighting this war. I suspect he doesn't want to, because it's becoming more painful on different fronts.
Very costly. John, a New York Times article, I think it was today or yesterday, read that nearly 2 decades after the 2007 Munich conference, where Putin demanded less dominance, less American influence, and a new balance of power in Europe, he might just be about to get what he asked for. What do you make of something like this, that it might be the US actually handing over this goal that he had all those years ago?
Well, I think if you go back to those days and see where we are now, then the West is a diminished force in global affairs. The Russians have used violence to change borders, and in the case of Ukraine right now, they are fighting to achieve broader goals, which are simply to reformat the country, to prevent it from integrating into Euro-Atlantic structures, into I believe both the EU and NATO. And seemingly, this US administration takes a quite pragmatic view and says, well, is that really anything so unusual? The Russians have grievances here, and you have President Trump at the same time talking about Greenland, using probably coercion or even force to take over Greenland, the Panama Canal. So it's almost as though you have a US and a Russian president speaking the same language. Now, what will materialize, of course, is probably something different. We saw that during Trump's first term, that the rhetoric doesn't necessarily match the end result. But it does feel in Trump's second term that there are fewer, if I might put it this way, adults in the room in Washington. There are fewer people who are committed to the old transatlantic relationship, and I think one could say there are people in the administration who feel that this is the time to achieve a revolution, not just at home but also in international affairs. So somebody said to me yesterday that they're actually looking to build a new transatlantic relationship, and it's a relationship with their friends and those people who ideologically are on their wavelengths.
It's a new world, John, but do you think this is the closest Putin has ever been to getting what he wants?
I think probably yes, but whether he really will get what he wants. And then I ask myself the consequences if he does get what he wants. What's very intriguing to me as somebody who studies Russia is that the system that he runs to operate and to maintain its cohesion, it requires an enemy. And if the United States is no longer an enemy in the ways it was, then who is going to be that enemy? Who's going to perform that function? How's this system going to keep actually working? And it's quite ironic that in the late 1980s, the Soviet leadership said to the West, "We are going to do something terrible to you." And people shuddered and thought, what's going to happen next? And they said, "We're going to deprive you of an enemy." And in a way, that's had a very deep effect on the way we've run our affairs since the end of the Cold War.
European allies held an emergency summit today in Paris in the aftermath of the Munich Security Conference. What do you think will come out of this?
I think we'll hear some strong words about the intention of the Europeans to stand by Ukraine. I hope that we will hear an insistence on their part that Ukraine needs to be at the table, that decisions can't be taken over the heads of Ukraine, and particularly decisions that have a broader effect on the security of Ukraine's European allies. So we will hear, I suspect, those words of encouragement. And let's keep in mind that Keir Starmer is due to go to Washington, I believe, next week. And the UK has been, I think, quite careful, not to use inflammatory language in any way. So I think what will come out of this Paris meeting is probably quite restrained. But at the same time, those European allies will be looking to communicate to the Trump administration that they are going to invest in defence, that they have heard the message loud and clear, and they are acting on it immediately.
John Lough, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.